Welcome to the Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is Matt Cuda, the voice of reason in the nature photography world. So, what's going on in my world? This week has been an interesting week. I have had a lot of difficulty this week. The birds were not wanting to cooperate with me, which is, it happens. I took a trip over to a local park. We had a confirmed sighting of a bald eagle, and it was a nesting bald eagle along the Yadkin River, and I was heading over to that location Saturday morning. I got there and had to wait for the park ranger. North Carolina is kind of weird how their parks work. They don't open when you think they should open. Typically, they're opening now around 8:30 in the morning, which is just ridiculous, I think. It used to be they opened at sunrise and they closed at sunset. Not anymore. They open at 8:30 in the morning. So anyway, I'm sitting there waiting for the park ranger. Park ranger arrives, opens the gate. He goes through. Me and my son crank up the Kia Soul, and we head down the dirt road. Well, we're about maybe 100 yards in, 150 yards in, down the dirt road. And I see the park ranger in front of me slow down, and then he crosses a small stream. Yeah, a stream, a creek. There's actually a ford. There's no bridge there. So I've got my little Kia Soul, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't think this is going to work. And not only that, I'm looking at the sign, and there are 3 fords ahead. So I definitely thought better of it and turned around. But this has happened to me twice now within 5 months. And so I'm getting a little bit frustrated. One of the problems is, when you start getting out into more rural areas and you start to take your wildlife photography to a different level, you start running into these type of things. Sometimes it's worth it going out on these trails. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're dead ends, literally dead ends. And sometimes there's just nothing to see. But it got me thinking, I've missed a couple pretty good opportunities recently. And I've been thinking about buying a 4x4. And so I started doing some research on this. And I think as nature and wildlife photographers, it's probably not a bad idea to have, a decent 4x4 to get around in. So I looked at several models. I've looked at the Chevrolet Colorado 4x4. I've looked at the Bronco. I've looked at the Ford F-150. I've looked at the Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk. I've looked at Jeep Grand Cherokee Trailhawk, or the newer, smaller Jeep Wranglers. I mean, I've just looked at everything. And what I think I'm going to do, and what I think would make a good vehicle for a wildlife and nature photographer, is the Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk. It's got all the amenities that you would need. It gets about 28 miles per gallon highway, which is pretty doggone good for a 4x4. It has a locking rear differential for better torque in certain situations. It has multiple features like hill ascent and hill descent, automatic hill ascent and automatic hill descent. It has, of course, 4 low, 4 high. It's higher off the ground because it's a trail hawk and it's trail rated. It can ford water 20 inches deep at 5 miles an hour. I think that's kind of what you would want to be looking at, is something in that territory. You probably want to get something trail rated if you go down that road. But I wouldn't buy an extra vehicle. But if you're going to replace what you already have anyway, go ahead and get something a little more suited for what you do on the weekends, I think. So that's what I'm thinking about doing. Probably not going to happen until maybe mid 2018. But I'll tell you what, when you've had to turn your vehicle around twice, it's a frustrating experience, and it's just not going to happen in the future, I hope. So anyway, this is episode 42, and we're talking about using flash in nature photography. And this is part 3. In the first part, we talked about more about the flash itself, which types of flashes to buy, how to mount the flash on your camera. We talked about episode 2. We talked about flash modifiers. We talked all kind of technical kind of things. And this episode, everything culminates into how to actually use it. Right? We've got all this cool equipment now. We've got manual flashes and TTL flashes. We've got old school flashes with auto thyristors. But how do we use them? How, as wildlife photographers and nature photographers, do we use these crazy things? Well, I have some photographs out here that we're going to take a look at in a minute. But before we do that, let's actually kind of enumerate the types of flash photography that I typically will do. The first type is what I call deep shade. And deep shade is just that. It's shady enough that you would have to use a flash. It's shady enough that you would not be able to use high ISO and get a good shot. So we're talking pretty deep shade, like inside of a forest canopy, for example. Maybe it's an overcast day and you're inside a forest. That would be a very dark scenario. And in this scenario, you're going to want to use full flash. You're going to have to use full flash. You're not going to want to, but you're going to have to. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that the flash actually illuminates the entire scene. So without the flash, it would be darkness. That's what I'm talking about there. The second type of flash photography is full sun replacement, okay, or studio setup. This is where you would just literally illuminate the entire scene with flash, but it looks just like daylight. Your goal is to actually replace daylight. And we see this typically with backyard bird photography, hummingbird photography, sometimes with setup photography at zoos and so forth, although not commonly done that way. So that's the second type of flash photography. The third type is something that I use a lot, and that is open shade using flash fill or fill flash, however you want to say it. I've heard it both ways. And this is where you are just you're using an ambient exposure like you normally would, but you're just putting a kiss of light on the subject. Just enough to bring out some of the color, the texture, fill in some of those shadows that make the animal look lifeless. That is where we as nature photographers pretty much live when flash is needed. So that's the 3 main types. I'm going to show examples here. I'm going to get right into it. We're going to talk about these 3 types. And we're going to talk about how they come together, what scenarios you would use them in, and how it can make your photography better. So in the show notes, go ahead and click on the link, and that'll take you to my Flickr account, and inside of that, it will actually take you to an album. Okay, the first thing you're going to see when you bring that up, the first picture you're going to see is actually full flash or full sunlight replacement. Full flash studio setup. What you have in this, and you may know this because I've talked about this image before, but what you have here is a hummingbird, of course, gathering nectar from a couple petunias. And in order to do this, in order to freeze the wings of this bird, we have to use no ambient light, and it has to be a studio setup. So we have, in this scenario, I've got one flash illuminating the white background, and I've got one flash on each side, or 2 flashes up front, at various angles, usually around 45-degree angles, that are actually illuminating the bird and the flowers. This is a typical full flash setup. The flash durations are very short. We're talking, less than 1/16 power here. The flashes have to be very close to the hummingbird. We're talking, a foot and a half away from the hummingbird. And so we're talking about a very small area here. And it's probably the best way, in my opinion, to photograph hummingbirds. Again, the reason, if you want to freeze the wings completely and have no ghosting, then you have to use this very short flash duration with no ambient light. Again, I emphasize no ambient light. If any ambient light when we say ambient, we mean the light that is in the scene. So if you're shooting it, 10 o'clock in the morning, you're going to have, sunshine. So you want to shoot this in a very shady area, dark, shady area. And you want to shoot at a low ISO, like ISO 100 or 160 or something around that range. That will give you, that combined with, a 2/50th of a second flash sync speed and, 1/16 power or less. And you can get the same technique. So very important, very good, very important thing to learn if you like this type of photography. I did a whole podcast episode on it. I'm not going to talk about it at length here. So just go back, I don't know when it was. It was probably like somewhere around the 10th episode. I did a whole podcast episode on photographing hummingbirds. So this is part one of really how important flash is, even in today's world. Some people get this notion that, I don't need a flash today because my ISO goes up to 50 billion. Well, that's not true, because again, we're talking about quality of light. We're not talking about giving you enough light to light your scene. We're talking about light quality and quantity. So, this whole idea that I just crank up my ISO and I'm good to go, that's not true at all. I don't know how that whole thing got started. My guess is camera manufacturers, but it's just not true. Yes, it's great to be able to crank your ISO up. Okay, I love that. But it's not going to make your image have good lighting. That's not possible. So just going down through the specs here, you'll notice I'm at f13. That's to give me a lot of depth of field. I am shooting at 324 millimeters, which is a good, comfortable range to keep me away from the hummingbird, but still give me the right angle of view. I'm at a 2/50th of a second, and I'm at ISO 125, 1/125th. So total flash replacement. Okay, on to the next image. Okay, this is a Screech Owl Portrait. And this is a photograph I took many years ago at a Photo Wild event. This is predominantly full flash. Okay, this is what happens when you fire up the flash to light the whole scene. You still get a little ambient light in the background there, but even so, I think that's still a lot of that's the flash fall off behind it that you're seeing. I don't think that's a lot of ambient light. I think it's just flash fall off. It doesn't look that bad in this case. You're photographing an owl, which is typically out at night. So making it look like night is fine, I think. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Some people get real wacko about, a full flash photograph. I don't have a problem with it. Maybe that's my photojournalism background speaking. I don't know, but I don't have a problem with full flash, especially with an owl, for example. So now, what am I actually doing with my flash to get this effect? It's not complicated. If you have a TTL flash, this would be the flash that you would get just setting it at a normal, at its normal automatic setting. This is the exposure that you would get. If you wanted to use fill flash, and we'll get into that in a minute, then you're going to make some other adjustments. In this case, I'm using a manual flash. And manual flashes are just trial and error. There's no thyristor, there's no TTL. A manual flash is just, you have to know the distance. There's two approaches here. You can memorize the distance between your camera and your subjects at various focal lengths and f-stops and all that. I mean, there are actually real photographers that used to do that back in the old days. They didn't have a choice. They knew that if my subject, they might have a 50 millimeter lens, and they would look at their subject and say, okay, my subject's 10 feet away. I need to shoot this at f5.6. And they would actually memorize that. In today's world without film, we're in the digital era, and it's just trial and error. You pretty much can get a feel for it. I might say, hey, I'm shooting this owl, and I think he's going to be, f8 at, ISO 400 at half power, and then you try to shoot a shot at half power. And that wasn't quite enough, so you bump up your power setting a little bit or change your f-stop a little bit, and you try it again. That's the downside of using manual flashes. And TTL in this case, when you're shooting a scenario like this, TTL is by far a better option. I don't own any TTL flash. Well, I have a couple TTL flashes, but I don't own any large TTL flashes. And so I'm still using manual, and it works for me. It's not always perfect, but it works for me. Now, if you were doing this with TTL, like I said, it would just be kind of a set it and forget it thing. I mean, you just put your flash on your camera, set your sync speed, and it's going to pretty much get you this shot right here. This is probably the easiest type of flash photograph to make because it's pretty much automatic. Okay, moving on to the next image. This image is almost full flash. It's a little fill, just a little bit of fill, a little bit of ambient, but mostly flash. This is another Eastern Screech Owl. This guy was shot with my old 1D Mark II. I was using my 300 Tamron SP. A very good lens to use to get you started. I totally recommend that lens. 1/100th of a second at ISO 640. Now, the fact that this was shot at 1/100th of a second tells me that I was trying to get some ambient light in here. Otherwise, I would have just shot it at 2/50th of a second. This is I'm so low with my shutter speed here that you are doing what is called dragging your shutter. And you're getting a lower shutter speed so that you can bring that ambient light up. And so, it was not really flash fill, but technically I guess it is. But it's flash fill with a lot of main light, I guess is the way to look at that. So that's another kind of subtle variation that you can do. Bear in mind that when you are photographing with a flash, that, we talked about the inverse square law, and we talked about how the light falls off. Actually, what's happening is the light is just spreading out, and it's spreading out more and more and more, and it's dissipating. And it falls off at a predictable rate, and that's what the inverse square law is all about. So you have to understand that when you're using flash, you can't be a long ways away from your subject. You can use flash modifiers. We have, of course, in this scenario, maybe it would have been better to use a better beamer, which would basically increase that distance, if you will. What it does is that better beamer concentrates that light through a Fresnel lens, and that allows me to use lower power output, or it allows me to throw higher output farther. And that can mean, various things. If I'm using a better beamer and I back off my power, now I have faster recycle times. So I might get 3 or 4 shots off in a row. Whereas if I have a higher power setting, I might only get 1 or 2 shots off. It does get complicated. I know it does. I know. And the beginners are out there right now going, what the heck is this dude talking about? And all I can tell you is this. If this is very complicated for you to understand, start picking it apart. Start looking at, okay, what's he talking about? He's talking about full flash. He's talking about fill flash. He's talking about using all flash to replace sunlight. He's talking about all these things. So take one of those components that we're talking about here and pick it apart and do some Google searches and email me or email some other guy or whatever it takes to get you there. Flash doesn't have to be a monster. It doesn't have to be hard to understand. Yeah, it's a pain in the butt. It is. Flash is a pain. I would prefer to never use flash, but honestly, that's a dumb thing because there's just times when you have to use it. It's part of being a photographer. So many people are literally afraid of it. They're afraid to even go down that path. But I want to encourage you to go down that path and not be afraid of it. And do your research and do your tests. Testing is the best way to learn flashes. And that's why I recommend manual flashes to start with, because you can actually test it and learn the differences, the subtle differences in the light as you increase power and decrease power, or you open your aperture or close your aperture. You start seeing those differences, those gradations. Like we did here with this Eastern Screech Owl. We saw a little bit less light on this guy than the last image. Produces a totally different effect. Okay, moving on to the British Barn Owl. This is the next photograph. Here again, we are introducing more ambient light. Now in this shot, we have even more background light behind him, but still a strong flash, a strong main flash is present here. And, let's talk about that a little bit. Again, what do you like? This is very subjective. Do you like a strong main light? If so, you may like this image. Do you like more ambient light, less main light? We're going to talk about that in a second. But, photography is very subjective. What does this do for you? When I look at this barn owl, if I had not done this, his eyes would have been in total shadow. His eye sockets themselves would have been in shadow. He would have had no highlight in his eyes. He would have looked lifeless, uninteresting. With this, I think I see a little more life in him. He looks a little more energetic. This is all good. This is why we do what we do. We try to subtly introduce things in our photograph, sometimes not so subtly, but to make it a better photograph, One of the side effects you're going to see, though, here is very interesting. Now, if you look at this photograph, one of the things that makes this image an image I'm not really happy about is if you look down from about mid-wing down, you're going to see some grass in front of him. And you're actually going to see shadow being cast from the grass onto his body. And that's from my flash, actually. What's happened here is I've probably turned my camera vertical, and my flash went vertical with it. And what that did was it threw a shadow. If I had my flash much higher and pointed down, you wouldn't get that shadow. It would be down below him, or at least mostly below him. So that's little tricks of the trade. Now, this was shot years ago. I would not shoot this subject this way nowadays. This was something that I've learned to avoid, actually. But you may like it. It might be your thing, and that's okay. This is, like I said, very subjective. Okay, next image. Okay, now we're into some really cool stuff. Okay, this is where I live now. Okay, we're at Gatorland here. This is a great egret in breeding plumage. He's in some very plush green flowers and things. I think these are related to the hemlock. You wouldn't want to eat these things. But it makes for a pretty background for this bird. Now, this is a perfect example of fill flash, or as some say, flash fill. But it's so subtle that you can't even tell really that I used the flash. Not really. An experienced eye could tell, but this is where we get into the subtle creativity of using flashes. If you look at the metadata, you can tell I used the flash because I shot at f13. Okay, first of all, that's pretty small aperture, right? I shot it at f1/250. That's a dead giveaway because 1/250th of a second is typically most cameras' flash sync speed. We talked about that on the last episode. It's at 161 millimeter, ISO 400. This was my 70-300 Tamron. And if you look carefully at this image, if you zoom into this image, you will actually see the flash. If you look into his eye or his lures, you will see the flash reflection, and you will see you can see that the flash has actually lightened up the shadowy areas on his face. And that's exactly what I was going for. I didn't want to introduce a harsh flash here. I didn't want people to know that I used the flash. This is what we're talking about. This is where you really need to live in today's world. If I had shot this full flash, what would it have been like? It would have looked like nighttime. The greenery in the background would have been darker, much darker. The white would have been very white. It would have just looked like flash. If I hadn't used the flash at all, it would have been a decent photograph. There wouldn't have been anything wrong with it. But what that flash did was just give that little extra pop in there, a little more life to the image, a little more reflection off the feathers, making that stand out, making the head of that flower stand out more. That is a typical fill flash. Okay, next image. This is an image of an eastern screech owl. This is probably one of my most, quote, famous images. It's won many competitions. It's been published many times. It's a fairly interesting photograph. Lots of gesture. But the thing I wanted to bring out in this podcast episode is this is fill flash. This is a very typical fill flash scenario. Here I've got early morning. It's quite dark. Let's see, I'm up here at 12/50th ISO. I'm shooting at 1/125th of a second, trying to get that ambient light up in the background. I'm shooting at f4. It's about as shallow as I could get with that 70-200L. And I'm shooting at 200 millimeters. So, what did it do for this particular bird? Again, the highlight in the eye, critical. The feather detail, we're not losing all the feathers in the shadow. We're getting more color out of the bird. We're losing that drab, gray, brownish gray, muddy coloration that you get without using a fill flash. So again, a very subtle use of fill flash. Yes, in this image, I can tell that I used flash. Not quite as subtle as the previous image, but still very much in the fill flash range. And guys, it just pays off. It pays off when you use it, when you have to. Okay, so we've got two images left here. Let's talk about these. Now, what we've got, the last two images are photographs of a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And this was taken at Photo Wild also, by the way. These are not great example photographs here, as far as these are certainly not my best work, but I think they help to kind of drive a point home. Now, if we look at the first one here, it looks like a typical flash fill scenario. We've got an ambient light coming in from the background, and we have a strong main light. Now, some would argue this is a little bit too strong of a main light. I would probably agree with that, but for the sake of demonstration, I think it really will help us understand it. So right now, we've got the background properly exposed. And there's probably, a good two-stop difference here. If we quickly go to the next image, you will see what I'm talking about. Okay, here you have a background, and it, the background might be just a hair underexposed. I probably should have gone a little brighter in the background, maybe a half a stop. But you'll notice that the bird itself is very, very dark. And this is a scenario that you may find yourself in. And if you do, the only really good way to handle it is with a flash. Yes, I could have metered the bird and jacked up my ISO even farther and gotten a shot, but that's not really what I was going for here. So, you can see here that we've got, probably about a 2-stop, 3-stop difference from the previous image. So there's just times that you want to make that happen, and I can't emphasize that enough, how important flash is in this scenario. And it's so funny, when I was photographing this broad-winged hawk, I remember there were probably 3 or 4 other photographers around me, and none of them were using flash. And this is one of those scenarios where, honestly, I don't know what they were doing. I don't know what their images even looked like. It couldn't have been that good because literally it was in such deep shade that, and the only reason you have ambient light in the background here is because the foreground of the image was totally dark and the background had some sun back there, and that's why you're seeing that. Otherwise, you wouldn't even have seen that. So when I analyzed this particular arrangement, I realized that I had all this light in the background and I had no light in the foreground, and that immediately triggers in my mind, I need a flash. Because even if I could get the ambient exposure up enough for the bird, the background would have blown out completely. It would have been a white background. So I want you to understand how to recognize these type of scenarios. Carefully look at the lighting. Do I have a lot of light in my background? Is the light in the background the same as the light in the foreground? If it is, you might be able to jack up your ISO and get away with it. But typically with a scenario like this, you're going to have to go flash. I mean, that's just the way it is. I know I'm belaboring the point here, but I really wanted to drive it home with these last 2 photographs because they're perfect examples of why I use fill flash. And the difference is fairly astounding, I think you'll agree. Now, it would have been better if I had backed off my flash just a hair. Okay, remember that about these images. But overall, I would much rather have the first image than have the second image. And you say to yourself, well, Matt, you could just go into Lightroom and just jack up the exposure slider. Oh, really? If I had done that in this image, there would be so much noise and artifacts in this image that it would have been terrible. It would have been absolutely terrible. And so that's not a good option. Jacking up your exposure in Lightroom is almost never a good option. If you find yourself in that scenario, you've done something wrong. You're in recovery mode at that point. Whereas in this image, I actually could go in here because the bird itself is exposed properly, maybe just slightly overexposed. I could easily go in here with my paintbrush and actually paint in a little less exposure. And there's nothing wrong with that. That won't hurt the image at all. I'm not going to get any noise or artifacts. That's that. I mean, there it is. So, I guess to conclude this, how do I know when I need to use fill flash? How do I know when I need to use full flash? How do I know? That's a good question. That's a very, very good question. One, right off the bat, I'm going to tell you, is experience. Experience tells you that. But there are some hard, fast rules. I just talked about the differences in light between foreground and background. I think also you need to think about where you are. If you are in shade at all, there's a good chance, not always, but there's a good chance that using just a little bit of fill flash will give you a much better result, especially with birds, but even human beings as well. You see this all the time. Pick up a wedding album. Just pick up a wedding album from a well-known photographer. I guarantee you'll at some point in that wedding album, if it was a good shot, you will see a scenario where they took the bride and groom outside under a tree beside a tree, somewhere beside the church, and they photographed them there, and they popped a little bit of fill flash in there to lighten up their eye sockets and stuff. That is just the name of the game. That's, for wedding photographers, that's a no-brainer. They do it all the time. Are there alternatives to flash in this scenario? Yes, you can use reflectors to fill in light in the eye sockets and so forth, but wildlife is not going to stand still for you while your assistant goes and gets the big old reflector out and stands in front of it and fills in the shadows. So that's why, for us especially, the fill flash is very important. When do I know that I need to use full flash? The answer to that is actually fairly simple. Use full flash when you're in almost complete darkness. When your shutter speed, even after bumping up your ISO, is so low that you can't handhold it anymore. You cannot get enough light gathering on your sensor to actually make a good shot. That's a scenario for full flash. When you want to freeze action in an image, that's an example of using full flash. So take a look at these scenarios, think them through. Hopefully, again, this whets your appetite to go out and research. There are books written on this. There's websites that are just about flash. The Strobist. There's just tons of this stuff out there. And the good news is that wildlife photographers typically don't get into extravagant studio strobe setups and things like that. So mastering a flash at the wildlife end of things is a whole lot easier, trust me. Okay, so let's move on now to our Know Your Subject segment. So in this Know Your Subject, I wanted to talk about the common loon. The common loon. According to Cornell's Lab of Ornithology, common loons are large diving water birds with rounded heads and dagger-like bills. They have long bodies and short tails that are usually not visible. In flight, they look stretched out with a long, flat body, neck, and bill. Their feet stick out beyond their tail, unlike ducks and cormorants, looking like wedges. Common loons are stealthy divers, submerging without a splash to catch fish. Pairs and groups often call to each other at night. In flight, notice their shallow wing beats and wavering flight path. Common loons breed on quiet, remote freshwater lakes of the northern U.S. and Canada, and they are sensitive to human disturbance. In winter and during migrations, look for them on lakes, rivers, estuaries, and coastlines. During breeding season, they are predominantly in Canada, Maine, and Alaska. In the winter, they are up and down the East Coast. Okay, the common loon. I would love to photograph the common loon. I have not seen one in the wild. I have not been to Canada. I don't get up there. It's just not going to happen probably anytime soon. Typically that's where you see them, is in the Maine, Canada, Nova Scotia, places like that. Down here, you may see them in the winter on the coastline. That's where we would more than likely be able to photograph them. They are on my list. They are absolutely on my list. I wish I had more information about photographing the loon. If you have information you'd like to share with me on places that you go on the East Coast of the United States, shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to even put it on the web, the podcast. So the common loon, it's something I think needs to be on everybody's list. And all I can do, with species that I don't know much about, all that I can do is do a little research online and share them. But they're absolutely stunning bird. They've got that red eye, and they've got that I just can't explain it. They're like they have that black or dark color mingled with the red in their eye, mingled with the white and gray colors in their feathers, and they make that just amazing sound. And there's nothing like it out there as far as birds go. Well, that's about all I had for this episode. Thanks again for all you do. Thanks for getting out there in nature. Thanks for keeping this podcast going. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.